I'm Marcus Cruz. I'm an architect who studied in Porto, in Portugal, but also for 2 years in Spain, in Barcelona. Did a master's here at the Bartlett, and then a PhD in architecture here at UCL, and have been in London now for over 25 years. No, there is nobody who was an architect, but my father and grandfather were in the construction business. And my father always told me when I was a young boy that what was amazing about the construction world was when you build something, something was left behind that was a bit like a monument. There was something special. It stayed on a large scale and you could inhabit it, you could go there. And that made me think that was something quite special. Your job left something behind that had an impact on people. And in fact, my grandfather was active with some beautiful buildings that were designed by architects in Angola. At the time was still Portugal. And I remember looking at the photographs and it looked magic. These buildings were amazing. They were modernist buildings, some of them with quite a bit of color, and they looked advanced for their time. They looked very futuristic. And I like that sense. And in fact, when I was in Porto and was growing up in Porto, since the city is a quite old city, I was less exposed to the more contemporary side of architecture. I was more used to face and be exposed to the Baroque of legacy of Porto, or the medieval side of Porto, and then the 19th century that really demarcated very much sort of the city and the imprint that the city has. So the contemporary side really for me was represented through these photographs of architecture that Portuguese architects did in Africa. I only figured out much later, when I was already an architecture student, that in fact some of the most advanced buildings had been done in Africa. It was not just an impression through these photographs. That was actually the truth, because you could design far more interesting buildings during the dictatorship period abroad than in the country. So that created this sensibility for architecture. And I always liked drawing. I always felt that the expression through drawing made me think. I could think through what I was drawing, and I still do that nowadays. In other words, you can look at something, you might think you understand it. The moment you start drawing it, you start understanding it in a different way. I guess it's the same thing that happens to people who write, who start writing about something and they start understanding it in a different way. So linking drawing with the legacy of building, this idea that you leave something behind that has an impact of people, made me become an architect. It's an interesting question, because I studied in Porto, and I have to say I was a very proud, and still am a proud architect who studied in a city that is known, world known for its architecture. It's really a city of architects, and there are cities in the world that are prone to create interesting people in the field of architecture, and Porto is definitely one of them. And there are interpretations that Porto, through its topography and the way that you see it from the bridges, etc., looks like a grand model. There's somehow a feeling that it's made and it's full of tectonic qualities. But I was always slightly against this sense that there is a language that is predefined. Something that everybody follows a certain trend and a certain mannerism. And I didn't like that. That was something I never engaged with. So maybe because of my German background, because I studied in a German high school in Porto and my home was entirely German speaking, I had a different way of thinking. The idea of zeitgeist for me was very present. What are the technologies of our days? What are the things we can do that we couldn't do in other periods? And I always was slightly scared of the feeling that we might be doing something, and years later I look back and said, but that was completely out of its time. It didn't make sense anymore. Nobody was interested in that anymore. So this zeitgeist, this feeling that it's good to be part of our time, and I think we humans have a great capability to look backwards. So we look backwards and we say, oh, you can analyze everything that happened in a way that was positive or not. We have much more of a difficulty to understand what happens in the present time. And when we look to the future, we have great myopia. We actually can't really look into the future. Very few people have the sensibility to do that. And I always like the idea that we architects, we are propositional. We are creating things that were not there before. So we are thinking about the future naturally. And as a more sort of anxious type as I am, I felt there was no interest for me to look too much into the past when the future was a really interesting space to explore. And Porto didn't have so much of that. Porto was very much known as a scene of architecture in the present and in the past. But there was far less of an understanding of where does this go? What's the impact of the architecture in the future? And I tell another story. I think there is something about the place where rivers are created and the springs and the places where the rivers land in the sea. And I think both points are very interesting. And Porto clearly is a city that is at the end of a trajectory of a river. It's where many ideas end. And it's a great place for digestion and interpretation of things that historically, by the way, arrived always late in Portugal. I always heard that sort of from history classes, etc., that what was happening somewhere in Central Europe at some point arrived in Portugal. But then the interpretations often were very fascinating, really interesting. In fact, sometimes more interesting than what happened in the spring, means in the point of emergence. But I was interested in the beginning. I wanted to go to a place where the ideas are emergent. And I wanted to question, what are these emergent ideas? And when I was a student, I discovered Friedrich Kiesler. And I liked the idea of interdisciplinarity. I liked the idea of mixing different fields together and being original, creative, and not being a mainstream. I always liked the architects who were not the mainstream architects, the ones that in the periphery have done fascinating, fabulous stuff, but really influenced the scenes around, and often in a quite indirect manner. And Kiesler was one of those characters. He appears historically, every now and then Kiesler appears as a seminal figure, but very little talked about. Why? Because he can't be copied. He can't be mimicked. The mainstream architects, they produce stuff that everybody can sort of copy. And architecture students, as we know, sort of they open the magazines and they copy some stuff. Whereas Kiesler is different. You need to stop with it. You need to figure out where to position yourself. And with Kiesler in mind, and the notion of the spring of ideas, where the source of new ideas came from, I was driven to come to London. I was very keen to come to London because I knew there was a scene here that I didn't understand. But a lot of new ideas were generated in a place like London. And that's when I came to do a master's here at the Bartlett, where Peter was the person who ran the master's. So Peter became a very big influence for all of us at that time because he was clearly somebody who inspired discussions about what's the future. And I felt entirely at home. In fact, one day I was sitting in a conference in the Architecture Association in Lisbon. And there was a discussion about the work that I had presented in the audience. And one colleague of mine said, do you know, you are one of these characters who I would classify you were Bartlett before you went to the Bartlett. You were already a Bartlett person, even before even ever getting there. And I think that happens. You have people who are AA before even going to the AA. They were Bauhaus before going to the Bauhaus. They are somehow in the spirit already very much what the place is where they then go. And that's why they feel comfortable. And then they thrive with the ideas and the things they do. Because they are part of a scene even before being there, but they have heard of it. And that gives them then sort of the scope to develop things. Well, I would clearly consider the influence of Peter huge. Peter Cook was a very big influence and still is for everybody who was ever involved with Peter as a student or as a colleague or in projects, because he's really somebody who, even with his age right now, has a phenomenal positive thinking and drive to produce new things. And this sense of what he was calling stuff was really quite powerful. The idea that we are creating stuff that is interesting, that makes us think through what we do. I had great teachers, by the way, in Porto. And I had teachers who were not only great because of what they told me that I would believe in, also because of what things that they said to me, which I didn't believe in, but I wanted to prove them wrong. Where I said, I think what you're saying is limited, and I need to prove you that actually, I think the architecture is about much more than that. And I remember as a student, I did a deconstructivist project, which in Porto was a pretty unusual thing to do. As far as I know, the only and probably the first one that was done really in a manner, and we're going back here to probably 93. So Zaha is in her period where some of this deconstructivist stuff is really thriving, and Peter Eisman and others. And I did this project and it was highly criticized. People hated it, but I think many of the students and colleagues they felt liberated by it because they felt, well, there was something daring. And in fact, it was done in a project that was supposed to respond to all the legal legalities and legal issues that were happening in the old town of Porto. So with all the restrictions, pretty much all the students my colleagues, they went into doing something much more normative. And I just thought, this is the moment to break basically the rules. The rules are there, they're applied all to the building, but the language just was explosive. And of course, some of the tutors, they tried to tell me of how, not my tutor directly who supported it, but other tutors were sort of telling me how, not of a great answer this was. And I felt that is the problem. There's something to fight against. And I think in the history of architecture happens all the time. We need what I call our friendly enemies. We need those people who we admire, who we think have done great stuff, but they're also becoming intellectually our enemies because we want to prove them wrong. And we want to prove them that there is a different way of doing it. And I would say nowadays, for instance, with green walls, it's a bit something similar. I like, of course, the green walls that have been built, but I don't like them, on the other hand, because they're monocultures of design, of plants, of species, of ecologies, which don't make sense. They're highly unsustainable. Now, the gesture itself is interesting, but it becomes a monoculture of a few species that are very beautiful from a theatrical point of view, but from an ecological point of view, makes no sense at all. So it's good to fight with these things and figure out what are the alternatives that one can produce. And if you do it through making, not just through talking, then that's a double challenge. You need to actually design something or make something that shows that there is a different way. And that's interesting. So when I came out of the university, I worked in practice for a relatively short period of time. So I had actually my own company. I had worked in some offices. And I did it before the masters, before coming to London to do the masters here at the Bartlett. And then right after the masters, I was actually involved with Peter and Colin in the Kunsthaus Graz competition design. So we were 5, Peter, Colin, Niels, Mattis, and myself. And for me, this was a great opportunity to bring some of the work I had done in the masters into a competition design, which, won the first prize. In fact, it was built. So there was a reassurance for many of us, and surely for myself, that many of these ideas could be made. You could actually realize them, which was an amazing thing. There was, in a way, in this experimental field, there's always a certain skepticism. Oh, it's experimental, you might not be able to do it. But the Kunsthaus was a proof that you can actually make things happen. It's a reality. So then I had a practice with my colleague Marian Coletti. So Marcus and Marian was a practice which we had for nearly 15 years, where we did some projects. We built a project in Portugal, the Lisbon Book Fair, and did lots of installations. But I think in hindsight, we didn't build more because our work was too academic, and that is that it was too complex. So there was too much of an idealism in place to make exactly what we were doing in academia to become a reality. And that was a translation that didn't work. Things became too expensive or would take too much time. And we won some competition in China, but again, we didn't have the infrastructure to do it. So at some point after starting a PhD, I had to decide what I was investing more time in. And I think for Marian and myself, both doing a PhD, we had a very pivotal moment. We were doing this research for a very long time. Marcus and Marian was actually thriving, but we were not going to end the PhD because it was just going on for so long that we were not going to finish it. So I decided, and Marian as well, to focus on the doctoral studies and finish it. And when we did it, the practice lost its drive. And Peter, in fact, was highly against it because he's always said to me, the PhD, is meaningless if you don't have a practice. And he was right, but it was a decision. So then time had passed, I became the director of the school, and academia became very much my life. And more recently, we created Studio Biocene with Brenda Parker and others, which is again a studio to start designing things and making things. So there is always this parallel between the academic field and practice. So Studio Biocene works between academia and practice. And that means that we have obviously a research link with academia, and that's BioID, Biointegrated Design here at UCL. But at the same time, we do smaller projects, installations, but also slightly bigger projects that we are now starting to do. We designed a Biocene house, which was a competition where we were shortlisted here for the London Festival of Architecture. Now we are going to do a second competition. And that means that in Studio Biocene, our aim is to apply the research we are doing in BioID. So clearly, we are doing research in the university, students doing the masters, but also PhDs, and we have funded research, and the translation into practice comes through Studio Biocene. Now, as it happens, when you're not in practice all the time, it's difficult to get clients. The clients that trust you to design a housing block or a museum. This doesn't come from nowhere. This comes from a portfolio of projects. So what we're doing currently is just building up this portfolio. And we have to put this in context. I'm not interested in doing some normal housing block here for the Olympic Park. I have no vested interest in designing something that is pretty box standard. The idea here is to bring in this bio-integration into the design, and that's challenging. So I'm very careful in choosing what projects to do. In fact, there were certain ideas of designing other work where the application of biointegration was not going to happen, and it was best to leave it aside. Because I'm not going to spend all these years in my life working in academia and developing radical ideas, and at the same time doing some stuff that has nothing to do with it. I know very good people who do that. They go into the office and build some bizarre buildings, but what they do in academia is absolutely phenomenal. And they seem to have a sort of schism in their mind between these two worlds. I don't have that schism. I do not want to build uninteresting architecture, have no interest. And I think there's too much ugly stuff around anyway. In fact, if I'm maybe critical, I think our field of architecture is one of the ones where you have the biggest amount of bad professionals. I think we have a tremendous quantity of bad architects. And that is also because we have a lot of bad architecture schools. We have places where the education is appalling and where the legislation is appalling, and where in fact the society at some point doesn't even give architects any value anymore. And there are very few places in the world, including, for instance, the city of Barcelona, where there's a recognition of what an architect is. There's a sense that the identity of a place is determined by architects. So there's an admiration for the role of the architect, for the hard work, for the creativity. And I think we architects, if we want to be really meaningful agents for the future, we need to stand very close to our values. If we sell ourselves commercially just to do the stuff that sells well, we are losing completely the agency. And in fact, we are losing the respect, because there are lots of people doing it without any titles of architecture, and they can design it quicker and cheaper. They don't need any architects. We are just a bother. And in our times where things are even more challenging due to new technologies, the speed of construction, we really have to be careful with what we are contributing. So Studio Biocene might be too slow, might be too interdisciplinary, but at least the projects we are doing are coherent with the values that we have. And I think that's incredibly important. Now, the academic world, I think, has also gone through a big shift. And I recall when Peter was actually not around anymore, but Frederick Migru joined the Bartlett. There was a lot of discussions about what is the change that we're going to introduce. And Frederick was making a comment that in the 80s and 90s, so in these preceding 20 years, novelty was drawn to a large extent. You had to draw what was novel. The 60s and 70s have much more made stuff. The 80s and 90s, in terms of novelty, we're relying on drawings. And Frederick was making a statement that in the year 2000, from the 2000 onwards, the made was becoming again the driver of novelty. Through prototypes, through demonstrators, through materials. That was, we couldn't rely anymore only on drawings. We needed the physicality of things. And that means that academia has actually made a shift to become much closer to practice than before. Because before, lots of people were learning to draw, how to draw, but they couldn't build at all. They didn't know how to do details. They were going into offices and doing it for the first time. I think we have the capacity currently through academia to learn how to deal with materials, make choices, to look at the tools we are using that is closer to the reality. We are bridging more the links with reality. And that's a positive thing. So I'm definitely one of these tutors who have made the education of architecture more practice-oriented than more distant. And that is to bring it closer. And that's why I think many of our students, when I was teaching in Unit 20, and students in BioID go back into practice. Very few of them become theoreticians. Quite a few of them actually teach. But many of them are in practice because that's what I think is important, is that they go back into practice to change practice. We are focusing a lot on integrating biological systems and design. It's easy to be said, very difficult to do, because there's a scale-up challenge. And there's also a challenge of how to control what is grown in the laboratory and then bring it outdoors and realize that what happens outdoors is all part of a consortium of species and the rules are very different. So we have a translation problem. And for me, what is really fascinating is that buildings, different from what we learn, are never going to remain new. We learn when we are designers to focus on what is the new. What is draw something, hasn't been there, we build it, there it is, and then we take our hands off and we dash off. But in reality, the building has just started to be alive. That period of being alive is what I call aging. In fact, in English language, aging has a great quality because it doesn't mean what you would translate in other languages, olding. Olding doesn't exist, but envejecer, or envelhecer, as you say in Spanish or in Portuguese, it would be automatically something that would be considered as old, as negative, as potentially a degradation of the process. But aging means something to do with age. And age is not negative. Age actually has power of knowledge, is actually wise, potentially. And aging is a gradual process, and buildings do all age. So if we design for aging buildings rather than for new ones, we need to rethink what we do, because buildings will gradually age because they have bacteria and species that grow on the facades. The roofs will change. The uses will change inside the buildings throughout time. And if we start thinking that what we're designing is for that type of change to occur in a beautiful and interesting manner, then we need to change the materials. We need to change how the spaces are articulated. And that for me is fascinating. I think I'm not so much interested in the flexibility of the program per se, but the idea that we design for an adaptation that is going to happen gradually. My colleague Harry Watkins is picking up on an old topic which is to do with fitness landscapes. And I was very challenged the other day when Brenda, Harry and I, who are writing a book, were discussing the difference between resilience and fitness. And he was sort of explaining that the notion of resilience is very defensive. You're resilient, you're holding on to, defending certain principles or materials against something that is encroaching or attacking it. It's a defensive principle. Fitness means a dynamic one, means proactively engaging with change. So fitness landscape for me is more interesting than the resilient landscape, because it's to do with the capacity of adjusting, adapting, and in fact transforming. And I think architecture needs to have that capability, that we don't remain rigid and petrified. Look, another thing that I'm very interested in is to do with notions of water. I think we have in architecture always tried to get rid of water. Our original tent, one of its main functions is to, protect us from water, from the sunshine as well, but mainly from water. Now, water is very scarce. If you think, we have a real need of water because a lot of the water we have is polluted or it's not there, and when it comes in too much quantity. Hence, water absorption is very fundamental. Now, think about a principle. We have as humans, and architects had a main role, created a lot of new surface in the world. All the buildings that we have created have a surface. And I did a calculation of buildings here in London, and I realized that buildings can have from 3 or 4 times the footprint in terms of surface area to around 18 to 20 times the amount of surface area than the footprint. In other words, you take a building and it has a particular surface on the ground, that's the footprint, but if you calculate the entire area of the facades and the roof that was created and all the ornamentation, it will be a much bigger area. But geographers never measure that, isn't it? When you look at the size of Peru, you would be looking at what geographers have determined as the area of Peru. But nobody has calculated how much surface area Lima has, or any of the other cities. In fact, Machu Picchu, how much surface area did it have? And if you think about the power of the surface as potentially being active and engaged and related to retaining and managing water, we could absolutely change everything that we are doing. Because where there's water, there's life. And where we have life, we have potential action and an exchange with the environment. And if we build with that in mind, what this means is that the entire design of the future can entirely change. Our cities could become, in fact, carbon negative if they absorb through what is growing. And our buildings are full of growth. It's just we don't even see it with our eyes. But if we promote that, so water retention for me becomes a very fundamental principle. But beyond that is even the interest in water typologies. What are the typologies we have had that we created that dealt with water? And I tell you a few small ones that I find fascinating. Take the notion of the gargoyle. The gargoyle in the medieval period is a little ornamental piece that sticks out of usually cathedrals or important buildings where water was driven out of the building from the roof down to the street. And it's an incredible moment, this idea that you collect water and you give it a direction and throw it somewhere. And of course, we have had a whole tradition of gargoyles. You think about Ronchamp with its gargoyle, it's an amazing piece. I mean, Ronchamp is not Ronchamp without the gargoyle and the little pool where the water ends. The other one is the grotto, another fascinating territory. Grottos have been built for a very long time in gardens as the counterpole for the geometry and the control of nature. The grotto is sort of the darker side, is the area of moisture, is the area of darkness, is the area of death. But decay and death and entropy produces a regenerative has a regenerative power and produces novelty and new growth. So the sense of completeness that exists between the highly geometric controlled gardening plus the bizarre, strange, obscure, mystic, rather difficult to understand grotto, for me is very interesting. And the grotto as a typology, I think, needs to be redesigned and rediscovered. Not that I'm interested in many gardens with grottos, but maybe buildings need to be understood more as grottos, or at least that they have grotto-like features in certain parts, because we have always the dark and the bright. We have the complementarity of both. There are places in the world where novelty can happen more easily. And I would say the technological novelty, the conceptual novelty, literally because all the people around are seeking to create novelty. And I remember when I arrived in London, what made me sure that I was in the right place was when I read a little article in The Guardian which said that London is the place in the world where the biggest amount of people came to meet other people that they couldn't meet elsewhere. So they were not here because the city is beautiful or because of love or because of whatever. They came here because they wanted to meet all those people they couldn't meet elsewhere. And that was exactly the reason why I came. And that means that novelty thrives in a context where everybody's keen on that, where people want to do that. And I felt back where I studied, I was part of a very small group interested in that. So you need to, in your life, look for those places where you feel surrounded by a context that stimulates you, that makes you thrive. I think that's unquestionable. Now, is novelty coming from the new vernacular? What I call the new vernacular? I think there is. The vernacular has a lot to offer. There's a lot of embedded knowledge, embodied knowledge in the past. So I think it's fascinating to look at the great examples of our past, because there's a lot of amazing stuff that we have produced. And especially the vernacular is something that is so rooted in a sustainable thinking mode that we are rediscovering the vernacular. That's why I call it the new vernacular, and other people call it that, because the new tools allow us to work with old materials and old techniques that probably are closer to be locally important, not to be transported around the world with things that actually the locals can engage with, than if we just import the models. So I have to say I'm fascinated in the complementarity of both principles. And that is the principle of importing new concepts, the idea of the spring where new ideas come from. And I think we will always in our human history have those centers, and London is definitely one of them. At the same time, I think the local conditions and the vernacular has something quite beautiful to contribute. And this is part of our time that's very contemporary, that the local is not just a nostalgia for the old. It's absolutely not that. The local is actually to search for novelty. The local is to do with embedded knowledge that exists that could be really meaningful and really actually changing the way that we are doing things. So I like that side. I like the discovery of local materials, but how can we reinvent them? How can we combine in a way that we have never done? How can we take techniques or languages and reinvent them through, the robotic capabilities that we might have? I think that's fascinating. That's an interesting relationship that we might find. I think biointegrated design is just starting. So we are just in the period where we are launching actually a whole series of new possibilities. And we're not alone here in London, of course. There are many other places. So there is a collective endeavor of rethinking biological systems in the field of architecture and what we're building. Now, there's a very shocking statistic, which is that our built environment presumably is going to double in the next 50 years. If you think about this, even if it's not entirely true, but we will build 60 or 70% more of what we have built so far, we're going to disappear. Because if we continue building in the way that we are, in this unsustainable manner, which we can't, and we would double the amount of infrastructure and buildings that we have built so far, we will collapse. That's a very clear, simple mathematical equation. So I think we need to turn it around and think this is our great opportunity. If in the next 50 years, what we are going to design will be completely new cities, that doesn't mean that the old ones disappear. They will be there. Everything will continue. But if the new that we are going to create really has a different logic, we are aiming for designing for aging buildings that we don't need to clean and wash and, make an enormous effort to make look new. If we're designing for a new coexistence with species, where we can coexist with what happens around us, even if it's dark, even if it's potentially pathogenic, we actually need it. It's part of our healthy condition that we have pathogens that create a response, an immune response in us that develops our antibodies to respond. And this is the old French theory that says that if our places are far too sterile, our health will suffer. So I talk a lot about the aesthetics of impurity. And that is an aesthetic that accepts that there is no perfection. And the impurity goes against the 20th century notion of purity. The right angle, the white surface, the idea that everything has to be clean and readable. I think that is over. The future is telling us that imperfection is far more interesting, within which we have certain levels of control and we can have fitness within it rather than resilience. So I would say the future is biointegrated and the future is still here to be created. We have no idea. We are just doing the first steps, interesting steps in that direction to figure out what this future could look like. And I welcome, to be honest, the students we have here and everybody else to join this endeavor to really start looking at what this other future could look like. It can't be what we see in the present, which is building is business as usual. That's not going to work. It needs to be something else.